want to give you a little something this morning. If you're just a little thirsty or not, I want to give you guys a drink of water. Can I do that? Can I just give you guys a drink of water this morning? You're going to split one? That's just not right. I don't know how I feel about that. I want to give you guys a drink of water. Jesus said that was a good thing. If you give somebody a drink of water in the name of Christ, you don't lose your reward. That's not why I'm doing this, by the way, but it just seems like a really good idea to start off with thirsty face. I can't leave out the computer room either, because that wouldn't be fair. That wouldn't be good. I can't leave out poor Ken. Here, I'm going to airmail it, Ken. See. Here, we're going to give you one over here. And don't chug the hand sanitizer. There's probably a sermon in that somewhere. I don't know where. Has everybody got a drink of water? I'm going to take a drink because it's such a good idea. Are you thirsty? I tell you, we're drinking in church. I don't know. Did you know 1% of dehydration in your body can have traumatic effects? You're something like 70, 80% water. And the Lord has given us this wonderful gift of thirst from time to time so that we know it. Your body requires water for almost everything. And as soon as you begin to lose some of what you have, all kinds of increasing strain begins happening to your body. In fact, they say that by the time you feel thirsty, you're probably past a certain point already. Don't wait. You don't need to get really thirsty. Just go ahead and have a drink. It's good for you. You'll start seeing symptoms if you start getting dehydrated. Of course, there's fewer trips to the necessary room, right? Dizziness and dry mouth and dry lips and dry eyes. Oh man, especially this time of year when it's so... hold on. Yeah, that was a good idea. I'm doing this every week from now on. A moment of discomfort from thirst can lead to a host of problems. Decreasing brain function. That's my excuse. I'm using that as my excuse from now on. Dizziness, confusion. In fact, some of the studies indicate that 75% of Americans are chronically dehydrated. Now, it doesn't mean that they're, all turning into raisins, right? It just means that they're not running at peak efficiency. I think how about I use that language? Does that work? Okay? You know more about medical than I do. I mean, you're way... Drink of water is good for you. I think part of the reasons why we suffer from dehydration in our society, in part is, we've got all these alternatives. I mean, my favorite alternative is coffee. It's filtered water. It's filtered through beans, right? But it's the sugary drinks and all of the other things, that tend to lead us towards a bit of dehydration. And I just thought, man, what a perfect introduction thought of making sure that we're not dehydrated as we get into Psalm 63 this morning, where David is yearning for the Lord, thirsting for the Lord in a dry and weary land. So how about I ask you just one more time to stand with me. You can hold your bottled water if you want to. And we're going to read Psalm 63. I'm going to take a drink while we do that, see? This is great. I got a new habit. Pastor was drinking in church. Oh, yeah, I skipped that. Okay. Oh God, you are my God. I shall seek you earnestly. My soul thirsts for you. My flesh yearns for you in a dry and weary land where there is no water. Thus I have seen you in the sanctuary to see your power and your glory. Because your loving kindness is better than life, my lips will praise you. So I will bless you as long as I live. I will lift up my hands in your name. My soul is satisfied as with marrow and fatness, and my mouth offers praises with joyful lips. When I remember you on my bed, I meditate on you in the night watches, for you have been my help. And in the shadow of your wings, I sing for joy. My soul clings to you. Your right hand upholds me. But those who seek my life to destroy it will go into the depths of the earth. They will be delivered over to the power of the sword. They will be a prey for foxes, but the king will rejoice in God. Everyone who swears by him will glory, for the mouths of those who speak lies will be stopped. Amen. You may be seated. Thank you so much. Take a drink on the way down. David sings about thirsty faith. You can break that psalm into the chunks that I broke it into. Really like the first verses 1 through 5, verses 6 through 8, verses 9 through 11. So that's kind of the tracks that I want to take as I walk through there. And I just want to begin with this idea of a thirsty faith. David starts out the psalm speaking about his quest for God, comparing it to being thirsty for God in a dry and weary land, right? We're going to go there, and then he's going to talk about his promise of satisfaction, and then last of all, by considering the end of a life either lived against God or for God, as it is described in terms of either being for or against the king that God has set in place. So David starts with this declaration of faith. Oh God, you are my God. And that is a declaration of faith that we can get behind, right? That's a good place to start, because our distractions can easily pull us away from knowing the basics. And man, we live in a distracted world, right? And we talked about that last time, with the phone was always blinking and is always buzzing and causing us to go somewhere else. David says, earnestly I seek you. And it just made me think of so many times when Jesus says things like, you will seek me and you will find me if you seek for me with all your heart. In other words, this casual, I wish I knew where Jesus was, isn't what he's looking for. He wants a wholehearted seeking, an earnest seeking after God. And he says, by the way, the verb there is an imperfect. I'm seeking after you. And it's this ongoing thing. So the grammarians among us, probably me, the grammarians among us, that just means that it's this ongoing seeking that's always present. I always want more God. Or because we were living in the New Testament, we know the name. I'm always wanting more Jesus. And it's one of my favorite hymns. I asked you to send me some of your favorite hymns. One of my favorites is More Love to Thee. The first time I heard that hymn, I wept. More love to Thee, O Christ, more love to Thee. Hear now the prayer I cry on bended knee. Marvelous song, one of my favorite. It is definitely one of my top 5 hymns as I think through the ones that I love the most. But David is describing this soul thirst for the Almighty. And his body as well as his soul is included. He says, my flesh faints for you, as in a dry and weary land where there is no water. So picture the image. Come into the Judean wilderness with me and just picture this image. You don't have to necessarily see sand everywhere, but there's no water and it's dry. It hasn't rained in a very long time, unlike what we're experiencing now. And the ground is parched, and the trees, such as they are drooping. The leaves are falling. It's been in the midst of a drought, and it's hot, and you're thirsty, and your canteen is empty, and you've even got to the point where you're no longer sweating because heat stroke is setting in, and you're at the point where you're fearful. You might actually pass out from the thirst. How badly do you want a glass of water? Right? It begins to consume you, and it begins to be the only thing that you can think about. If I could only get a drink of water, it's the only thing, and you daren't speak anymore because your throat is dry and your tongue sticking to the roof of your mouth, and you're just experiencing a profound thirst. And in the distance, perhaps you see a burst of greenery, probably an oasis. There's probably water there, and you begin to surge there with all of your effort. Just imagine the thirst and think about the world that we live in that is so dry and so lacking in the presence of our Lord and is so empty and is showing all of the signs of not having His presence and showing all of the signs of not experiencing His blessings, and we begin to show a thirst for God. And it just gives that question, are you thirsty? As I think about my own spiritual walk, and I think this week about your own spiritual walk, and as I prayed for each one of you, I prayed for a thirst. A consuming desire to know God more than you know Him, to experience Him in ways that you haven't experienced Him for a while, because our lives, with all of the distractions and with all of the other things that can pull us in 10,000 directions, and some of them are necessary. I mean, the dishes have to get washed. The bills have to get paid. The food has to get cooked. Things have to happen, right? It's not that the things of this world are unnecessary and we should stop being so, but that we can forget what is most important. And in the midst of serving, and in the midst of doing laundry and washing the car or repairing the car, and in the midst of working, and in the midst of all of these things, God can still be at the center. But so oftentimes, He gets pushed to the periphery. So as I read the psalm this week, and as I think about it, and as I come this morning, I have to ask you the question if you're thirsty. Do you want more of Jesus than you've been getting? Offer that man in the desert a movie to watch instead of a glass of water, and how interested do you think he would be? What if you offered that man in the desert some kind of a sexual escapade instead of a glass of water? Or a new car? Or a doodad? Or a thingamabob? When all he really wants is a glass of water. I think sometimes we throw other things in front of our lives that don't need to be there, and we allow ourselves to be entertained by them because we're content, thinking that perhaps we're maybe only 1% dehydrated, not realizing that we may be much farther down the road. In fact, if you have very little desire for Christ, it's actually an indication that you've gone far beyond just a small percentage of dehydration. So I got to ask the question then, what if I'm not thirsty? I mean, that's a frightful thing. What if I'm not thirsty? What if in my satisfaction with the world, I don't have a hint of thirst and I'm slowly dwindling from an unrealized dehydration of soul? What do we do? I start thinking, why don't people get thirsty when they're physically dehydrated? I mentioned some of these. We substitute sugary drinks. We drink too much coffee, which is itself as a diuretic. It just draws more water out of your system. Guilty as charged. Sometimes, and I've read this, and I can't prove it. I don't, but that Americans typically, because of the way we live, we don't know what thirst feels like anymore, and we think it's hunger. In fact, some dietitians say that you really ought to drink a glass of water before you eat meal. In fact, your digestion will improve if you drink water before you get to a meal. So we no longer know what thirst feels like. And I think if that's true in the physical realm, is there a truth to that in the spiritual realm? And I almost can't, as I just look at this psalm, can't get past the first verse. God, you're my God, and I shall seek you earnestly. My soul thirsts for you. My flesh yearns for you in a dry and weary land. There's no water anywhere. It may be that things are stealing our thirst from God away and satisfying us falsely because they are small and forgettable. It may be, if we're not thirsty for God, that we're masking the thirst with the false promises of satisfaction and things and entertainments and pursuits. But I want you to see in the next few verses maybe something that'll help to pique your thirst. To see something that will cause our thirst to be both awakened and quenched and to find the satisfaction in it. And he offers us some tips, I think, in this song. Some tips that help to move us from being thirsty to being quenched. And the first one is worship. It's worship on God's terms, not worship on our terms. Go lots of different places in the Bible with that even, including I thought of a passage in Leviticus. But I'm not going to take you there this morning because here he says enough. David's thirst drove him to worship, and I want us to notice how that took shape. He went into the sanctuary. The sanctuary being, don't think of this room that we call the sanctuary sometimes, or the chapel, or whatever else people call the main worship room. But the sanctuary in the temple or the tabernacle was the place where God had ordained to meet his people. And sacrifices and offerings would be made, and God would appear there. There's lots to say here about the forms and the functions of the Old Testament worship system, but I don't think that's where we need to go this morning. So we bring it simply to Jesus, who came, as John writes in his gospel in John 1:14, he came and he dwelt among us. That word dwelt is the Old Testament word in the Greek for he tabernacled. He built his tabernacle among us. It's this moment in the books of Deuteronomy and Numbers as God has brought the people out of, and Exodus, as God has brought his people out of Egypt, and he brings them to Mount Sinai, and he gives them the 10 Commandments, yes, but then he also gives Moses the directions, the instructions, the vision for this is what the tabernacle and all of the furniture is supposed to look like, and this is so that I may dwell in the midst of my people, and my people may dwell with me. And he sets up this tabernacle and initiates the offering systems that help to purge sin and to draw people with knowledge that their sin can never be atoned for by the blood of bulls and goats, and ultimately they're requiring something greater from God, something that they will find only in the midst of his grace. David prays about that in Psalm 51. We're not going to go there yet this morning either. But David, in his thirst, he runs to the sanctuary. He runs to the God-ordained place where God is to be met. For us, that would be Jesus. Running to Jesus. Seeking for Jesus. This wonderful promise, those who ask and seek and knock, those who have this unquenchable quest for finding me will find me, Jesus says. When you are thirsty for God, you will find him as you pursue him in worship. And there is a pursuit that happens here. He says, I will search for you earnestly. There is a quest that is unyielding. It's an unfortunate result of the very typically emotionally driven services in the seeker-sensitive movement of the church in America that has turned the worship event into an emotionally manipulative moment. And the quest in some worship in this country is not to help you to encounter the presence of God, but rather to evoke the emotional reaction. And so the emotional reaction becomes the quest. In other words, I'm just here for my own pleasure. And I don't want to throw that out and say, shame on us for wanting to feel good. That's not what that means. I think it's an expose that we're settling for so much less. If all we seek for is to feel happy. Because feeling happy will fade. But David specifically describes joy and joyful singing. And that arises from questing after and finding yourself in the presence of God. So I guess the first would be worshiping God on God's terms, coming and seeking actively for God and not for our own pleasure. And the second one is worshiping God theologically. In verse 3, David begins to celebrate because God's loving kindness, he says, is better than his life. And I would just like to draw that out as that's an incredibly true statement, but it's also a theological statement. God's loving kindness, or as I said, it shows up so many times in the Psalms. It's this covenantally faithful loyalty that God has to his people. And God says, I am covenantally faithful. And Jesus recognizes, David recognizes, well, Jesus recognizes it too, but David recognizes that God's covenantal loyalty or his loving kindness, that's how we experience God's covenantal loyalty, as we experience his loving kindness. It's better than life. And it becomes a theological worship, something that is true of God in His nature and His purpose. Now, unfortunately, theology has a bad rep in the church. People hear the word theology and they think, oh, dry and boring and scholastic. And I'll grant you that it can be that way. But that is not the truth. Theology proper, theology understanding the word, is simply the study of God, getting to know God better, and experiencing more of who He is by actually knowing who He is. And the more that we begin to know Him, the more we will irretrievably love Him. And David is simply responding to a point of theology. God is defined by His loving kindness. And David pulls out that one theological truth and he says, it's better than life itself. So he worships theologically. And again, it's one of the reasons why I love so many of the old hymns, because they are theologically rich. It's one of the reasons why I like some of the modern hymns by Keith and Kirsten Getty. The Gettys, in fact, they set out to write theologically rich modern hymns. That's their goal. And I think they oftentimes succeed. One of my favorites is that prayer, "Speak, O Lord, as we come to your holy word." It was written for their church to sing as they were getting ready to hear the word of God. But I don't want to digress there. To the thirsty soul, weary of the world, and to the soul who knows it's not as thirsty as it should be, seeking after God as He has revealed Himself will reignite your thirst and satisfy it at the same time as you draw closer to the one who has revealed in His word that He will draw closer to you. So there is a theological worship that David imparts or partakes in. He's seeking God on his terms, not on his own. And he's seeking God as He has revealed Himself, not as David wishes he would be. And the third thing I just want to point out is he actually is worshiping God with praise. And again, that's a directional tract that worship can take. He's worshiping God in a Godward way. There are psalms, as you read through them, that tend to, I'll say, point in different directions. Some of the psalms, and by extension, some of our hymns, some of our modern worship songs, they point in the same directions. Some of the songs point upwards towards God. Some of the songs point outwards to others. Oh, I love God's people, right? Some of the songs point inwards to our own experience. And I've never looked to see what the balance is in the book of Psalms, but one of the things that I've noticed and that concerns me is a great many of the songs that we might hear today seem to be entirely inwardly focused. If you kind of look at the direction they point, and it's not that that's a bad thing, because many of the Psalms do the same thing. I mean, there's self-talk, "Come on, O soul, you can worship Him," and "I am feeling miserable." I mean, those Psalms, they touch on that inward reality, but they ultimately turn outward to God. Because that's the proper orientation of our lives, is towards Him. It's like a plant. When the sun comes out, the plant, especially like, sunflowers, they will turn in the direction, I'm drawing the big circle of the sunflower. Thank you for having pity on me. The sunflower will track where the sun is at all day long. It's looking towards the sun. That's why they're called sunflowers. Plants will do that. They worship, I guess, in their own way by questing after that which gives them life. And that's what David is calling us to quest after that which gives us life. And through that, David's thirst is quenched as he pursues God in worship. And I just want to point that out. David's thirst is quenched not by being selfish with the reality of God, but by seeking after God and making God his primary pursuit. And then he steps into the next little block, verses 6 through 8. And I'll just call that the quenched life. He's had enough to drink now, right? This is the quenched life. I have it, my throat's dry. Verses 6 through 8 point us towards this thirst-quenched life. Seeking after God doesn't end with worshiping Him, either worshiping Him biblically or theologically or with praise. It starts there, and it enters into a life in which God doesn't play a minor role. And again, here's one of the things that concerns me with the way church can be. We come together in church and we worship and we experience Him together, and there's fellowship and communion, and all of those things are marvelous, and then we go away. And it's kind of like, it can easily become the last time in the week the first and last time of the week that we pursue him. But that's not what the quenched life looks like for David. The quenched life, God is still a part of his life every day. As a matter of fact, God's there when he wakes up in the middle of the night. Anybody in here wake up in the middle of the night? Man, that's been happening a lot to me lately. Seems like the last several months, it's just, eyeballs are open at 2:30 a.m. and there's nothing you can do about it. I went to bed the other night, just kind of, I laid down, looked up at the ceiling, and went, "Hello, ceiling, I will see you soon." Isn't that pathetic? It would have been funny if it wasn't true. David says, you know what? When I remember you on my bed, I meditate on you in the night watches. I think, man, what a distinction, what a difference, because what is it? And sometimes we don't know what wakes us up, right? But sometimes it's that argument that we were having that suddenly we figured out exactly what we should have said. Oh, yeah. Please tell me I'm not the only one guilty of the, if I'd have only said this. It's not always pretty. Help me, Lord, right? Some of us, it's the concern over the what if. What if this does happen? What if that doesn't happen? What if this comes to pass? What if that doesn't come to pass? What if the test comes back this way? What if I have to take a test? What if I have... Here comes the list. And sometimes it's just, the experiences of the day, and we're in the middle of replaying everything that did happen, and we're replaying everything that hasn't happened yet, but by golly, we're convinced it's going to happen. And you just get this sense what David does is there's moments in the midst of this where he remembers God. He says, when I remember you, when he remembers God, he goes, that is where I'm going to turn my heart and my mind. And he, perhaps through an effort of the will, perhaps because that's where he has practiced going. And I do find this to be true, that we are most comfortable treading the paths that we frequently walk. So if you are used to worshiping God, if you are used to pursuing him, then it becomes easier in the middle of the night when you wake up and all of those thoughts and all of those arguments and all of the replays and all of to begin turning your heart towards the Lord in worship becomes more natural. He says, I'm going to meditate on you in the night. Unlike Eastern meditation, pinch your fingers together and say the word that the universe makes. Om. It's this idea of empty your brain and don't think of anything so that you can get more in touch with the universe. Well, that's true. The universe is stupid. It has no brain. But that's not biblical meditation. Biblical meditation is fill your heart and your mind with God's word. Learn to think the way God thinks. Experience him and do so mindfully. Christianity is a thoughtful religion. It's not a foolish religion. It's not a stupid religion that leaves ourselves empty. Don't empty your mind. Fill it. And then look at the God-saturated life there in verse 8. My soul clings to you and your right hand upholds me. I want you to see the two things that are happening there. I'm clinging to you and you're clinging to me. In 1758, Robert Robinson was 23 years old. And he wrote the words to a wonderful song. We sing it every once in a while. It's actually number 11 in your hymnal, and I'm not asking us to sing it, but if you're curious later, it's Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing. Know the song, right? And he grew up, as he was growing up, he was he was a punk. One of the books I read said hoodlum, but I think punk would have been better. He was a dumb punk when he was growing up. Most of us were, but he certainly was. But eventually, through a storied life, he's brought to Christ. He becomes a Baptist pastor. He becomes a very able theologian. And notice the third verse of that song. It includes this phrase that has often filled me, with pondering, if not dread. Prone to wander, Lord, I feel it. Prone to leave the God I love. So here's my heart. Oh, take and seal it for thy courts above. The song turned out to be prophetic. Robert Robinson, in his elder days, drifted away from God and one day was traveling somewhere by stagecoach. And there was only one other occupant in the stagecoach, a woman who was sitting there engrossed in a hymn book that she was reading. And she began to hum that song. And then she began to discuss it with him, and he kept trying to change the topic, and she would have none of it. And she asked him his thoughts on the song, and pointed to that verse, prone to wonder, what do you think he was writing about? She didn't know who this was she was speaking with. And it says, Robert Robinson burst into tears and he said, Madam, I am the poor, unhappy man who composed that hymn many years ago. And I would give 1,000 worlds if I had them to enjoy the feelings that I had then. And very gently she replied, Sir, the streams of mercy still flow. As a result of that encounter, he repented and was restored in his faithful walk with Christ. Prone to wonder, Lord, I fear it. So here is my heart. Take it and seal it. Seal it for your courts above. I think God did that for him. The God-saturated life is a life that clings to God and finds that God is clinging to us as well. So I would ask you if you would find in your self-reflection, not only are you thirsting, but are you wondering? Is it time to find the streams of mercy and to drink again? Is the fire of your former love of Christ even burning? Pursue him. Pursue him in worship, biblical and theological, and just praising him. The God-saturated life is a life that clings to God and finds that God is clinging to them. And then he ends the psalm, and we'll end here with the well-watered life, is what I would call it, since I tried to stay on theme. The well-watered life, verse 9, and he begins to follow from there. He meditates there, he contrasts the idea, and I think part of the reason he's doing this is to remind him of one of the reasons why it is worth continuing to pursue and worship the Lord. Because there is an end that goes beyond this life. And for those that would set themselves up against God by pursuing the king's life, in this instance, those who reject the Lord, and this psalm demonstrated through their pursuit, all that remains for them is death. Death and the emptiness in the grave and misery and sorrow and an eternal lack of quenching we would recognize. They may, for a season, have victory and power and wealth and comfort, but eventually it all ends. David goes further to say they'll die by the sword, or they'll be prey for, my translation says foxes. It's actually not a great translation. Jackals, some of the translations say, the better translation. In other words, they're going to be prey for carnivores. Which seems kind of a weird thing until you recognize that David is writing from a position of one who has known what God's word has to say. And very typically, God has said, look, if you walk away from me, there are 4 in particular judgments that I will bring upon people. The sword, warfare, wild animals, as well as famine and plague. Those would be the 4 things that God will continually use, not to just abuse people, not to punish people, certainly mindlessly, but to jar them loose from the moorings that are empty and to draw them back to him as the one who can satisfy. In other words, God will make them thirsty so that they thirst for him. That's not the end of the God-soaked life. The God-soaked life endures and fills with rejoicing. And it brings us to that very final contrast, rejoicing for those who live a God-soaked life and the stopping up of lies of the rest. So, I look at Psalm 63 and it just makes me wonder if you're thirsty. And it makes me wonder, how hard are you willing to work? How earnest are you ready to be in your pursuit of having a thirst for the fullness of God satisfied? Lord, make us thirsty. And it's like apparently 75% of Americans are dehydrated and don't know it. If we're dehydrated and we're not even aware, I pray that you will bring to the surface once again that thirst that is unquenchable, that we will desire you. God, help us to desire you. If sin has kept us from desiring you, God, open our eyes and cause a voracious hunger to fill our flesh for you. God, if just the casual disregard of your presence has made us to forget our thirst, please awaken in us once again our thirst. Lord, if the prevalence of other spiritual sugary drinks has just filled us and made us not care, then please awaken us once again. In other words, God, I guess all the prayers come together in this simple prayer, that you will make us thirsty and that you alone will satisfy that thirst. Amen.